Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. I'm Dave Webb. I am convener of the organization, the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and its board of directors. Personally, I have a Ph.D. in space physics, and I'm a retired university engineering professor who switched to peace studies, peace and conflict studies in the last few years of my working life. So I'd like to thank the conference organizers for hosting this panel on campaigning to keep space for peace. There are a lot of really interesting sessions and speakers at this conference, and we will perhaps be giving a slightly different view to some of them. Unfortunately, this session clashes with some others of interest, so thank you for joining us on this one. I'm going to just give a short introduction and then introduce the panel members, and they will all have a chance to say something for about 15-20 minutes, and then we're open for questions from you. So I will just start my slideshow off. I think it's this one here. Okay, I hope you can see that okay. So first, let me remind you or inform you that last week was in fact World Space Week, which came about in 1999 when the United Nations General Assembly declared that October 4th to 10th every year should be adopted as World Space Week. And this period has also been adopted by the peace movement or by the global network as Keep Space for Peace Week. And recently there's been some media coverage of how important space has become for various state actors, including the US, Russia, and China, that there is a sudden push by these states in particular to dominate and control the space environment. However, the US Space Command and its successors have been talking about and working towards space domination since at least 1997, when it published its Vision for 2020. And this astonishing document recognized that so important are space systems to military operations that it is unrealistic to imagine they will never become targets. It's also recognized and accepted, or that document also recognized and accepted, the growing division between the global economic haves and have-nots. And it introduced the doctrine of full spectrum dominance. That is the military domination of the land, sea, air, space, and information to protect the interests of the haves. The space budgets of the main spacefaring nations give a hint as to why this push for space dominance is occurring. Space is now big business, with some forecasters suggesting it could be worth over $1 trillion by the year 2040. The military of a number of countries have also large space budgets, with a global annual expenditure of around $28 billion, and that's growing rapidly. In the US, it is the corporations such as Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, who stand to make billions of dollars from these programs and are a major driving force towards the militarization of space. These are the major operations for what the military uses space for. The focus here is on the US military use of space because we have more information about that. Similar operations are also being carried out by other major spacefaring nations such as Russia, China, and India, while other nations also participate in some areas. Perhaps we could have a quick look at some of these operations. The US runs a network of ground-based stations that it uses to identify and track satellites and space objects. These are either high-powered radars, such as the one at Fylingdales in the UK, or optical telescopes, as in the case of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean and Hawaii. Another global network of ground-based stations is used for gathering information by intercepting electronic communications and analyzing the vast amount of information that's collected with extremely powerful computers. The information gathered can supply details of possible military targets or the plans and strategies of rivals. Satellite communications networks also enable the military to command and control military actions almost anywhere on Earth at any time, so that commanders, large and small groups of military, and even individual soldiers can be informed and can feed back during exercises or in specifically military actions. Satellites are also an integral part of missile defense systems being developed to deny a response to a first strike, but also providing the possibility of delivering a first strike. Satellites are used to gather information on missile launches and missile trajectories using infrared sensors. On the left, you can see the current constellation of satellites used for this purpose. It consists of geostationary satellites of the Aging Defense Support Program, plus the space-based infrared system of satellites, some of which are in geostationary orbits and others in highly elliptical orbits, to give an overall global coverage. On the right is an image of the proposed new overhead persistent infrared system, which is due to replace the current system in the next few years. Missiles traveling at hypersonic, that is many times the speed of sound, are also being developed that would travel through space to help deliver a prompt global strike anywhere on Earth within 60 minutes. Unmanned space planes are also being developed and have already been tested, some staying in space for over a year before returning to Earth. And there are also projects underway now for developing various space weapons. So satellites and space objects are extremely important for the military, and they are becoming even more important as projects develop. The major problem with this, of course, is that satellites are extremely vulnerable to attack, and a number of different types of anti-satellite or ASAT have already been developed or are being developed. And just to add to all that, another major development occurred at the end of last year when Donald Trump authorized the US Space Force. At the time, he said that it marked a big moment and there was going to be a lot of things happening in space because space is the world's newest warfighting domain. US Secretary of Defense Mark Esper was quoted as saying that outer space has evolved into a warfighting domain. Maintaining American dominance in that domain is now the mission of the United States Space Force. Other nations are, of course, joining the new space race. Russia, China, and India have also already extensive military space programs, but others like Japan, South Korea, and NATO are joining in. And last July, President Macron declared that France had allocated 3.6 billion euros to its own military space force to take warfighting into space. And not to be left out, around the same time, the UK Defence Secretary at the time, Penny Mordaunt, announced a £30 million military space programme for the development of small satellites. Mordaunt also announced that today we show the sky is no longer the limit for our armed forces. And she also talked of facing up to evolving threats and of being the first partner in Operation Olympic Defender, a US-led international coalition aimed at deterring hostile actions by rivals. The escalating militarization of space, sorry, I've just lost my click. The escalating militarization of space is set to put an end to the view of outer space as a global commons to be used for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, as declared in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty was initiated by Russia, the US and the UK, and has 110 state parties, but it looks destined to be another treaty that the US is walking away from. So this panel will be discussing ways in which we are campaigning internationally to try to keep space for peace and how we might extend that work. So on the panel, we have myself, Dave Webb, convener of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and its board of directors. We also have Professor Karl Grossman, who is Professor of Journalism at the State University of New York and the College of Old Westbury on Long Island. Karl is a founder member of the Global Network on Nuclear Power in Space, and he writes extensively on space militarization and nuclearization. He's also hosted the nationally aired program Enviro Close-Up with Karl Grossman for the last 30 years. Dr. Aruna Kammila is an assistant professor of Damodaram, I can't say it very well, National Law.
Damodaram.
Thank you. Sorry. National Law University in India. She has a PhD from Andhra University on cyber warfare vis-a-vis international humanitarian law, and specialized in public international law and international criminal law at master's level. Tamara Lorincz is a PhD student in global governance at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has a master's in international politics and security studies and a law degree and MBA specializing in environmental law and management. And Bruce Gagnon is secretary and coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. He has been working on space issues for the last 38 years and helped create the network in 1992. He was trained as an organizer by the United Farm Workers Union and is also a member of Veterans for Peace. So we're all members of the Global Network. So now we'll take it in turns to go through the panel in the order that you see them on the screen. So our first speaker is Professor Grossman. Karl, over to you.
A pleasure to be with you all today. Let me start, and I've prepared a little talk. Under the current US president, I'm not going to name that person who has orange hair, the United States, in defiance of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, is moving to turn space into a war zone. The Outer Space Treaty, which Dave just spoke about, it declares space a global commons to be used for peaceful purposes, was put together by the United States, the former Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, and it's since been signed by, well over 100 countries on the earth. Craig Eisenkloth, and he's featured in a number of my videos on issues of space militarization and weaponization, and in many of my articles. He was a young US State Department officer involved in the creation of the Outer Space Treaty, and he explains, we sought to de-weaponize space before it got weaponized to keep war out of space. The Outer Space Treaty prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in space. The central mechanism of the United States in these days in opening space to war is this new US Space Force, which is to be the 6th branch of US Armed Forces. The current US National Administration and the US military have been claiming a Space Force is necessary because of Russia and China moving into space militarily. In fact, Russia and China and US neighbor Canada have been leaders for decades in pushing for an expansion of the Outer Space Treaty. They've been advocating a prevention of an arms race in outer space, acronym PAROS Treaty, under which the placement of any weapons in space would be barred. The US has opposed the PAROS Treaty and has effectively vetoed it at the United Nations. And I've been at the UN to see this. As the current US president has declared, it's not enough to have US presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. And as stated in the National Defense Authorization Act, which was signed by this person with orange hair in December, establishing a US Space Force, Space is the world's newest war-fighting domain. This despite the Outer Space Treaty. And subsequently, at the unveiling of a Space Force flag at the White House, this person declared, the president of the US, space is going to be the future, both in terms of, this is important, defense and offense. Yes, offense, US offense. Now, I've been to China, I've spoken with Chinese diplomats, I've been to Russia several times. What these nations want is the Paros Initiative and to not waste their national treasuries on weapons in space. But with the US now moving ahead with its Space Force, we can expect China and Russia and then other countries to respond in kind. China and Russia won't accept American dominance of space. The US move will lead to an arms race in space. The heavens will be turned into a war zone at huge financial expense. And if war breaks out, and I think it would be inevitable, it would be at the expense of many, many lives on Earth. Disturbingly, just a few nations so far are already replicating the US drive to ignore the Outer Space Treaty with the formation of a US Space Force by creating their own space military units. And Dave mentioned the several. The US Space Force, which has precipitated this, must be rolled back. Hopefully, voters in the United States will have a new US administration soon. But also, disturbingly, many Democrats in the US Congress voted for the National Defense Authorization Act and a Space Force. Democrats in US elected offices must join in a Space Force rollback and also get the United States to support the Paros Treaty. Here, grassroots action is critical. I mean, in my country, that's how change has really occurred, whether it be the civil rights movement, on and on. It's people at the grassroots, and that's why the global network against weapons and nuclear power in space is so important. Regarding the tie-in between weaponizing space and nuclear power, the architecture of the US space military drive of the 1980s, the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, involved orbiting battle platforms with nuclear reactors on them, providing the energy needed for hypervelocity guns, particle beams, and laser weapons. As General James Abramson, he was the director of the Strategic Defense Initiative, put it at a symposium on space, nuclear power, and propulsion. Without reactors in orbit, there's going to have to be a long, long extension cord that goes down to the surface of the Earth to power these high-power space weapons. Now, this all goes back further than Star Wars, to the original development of the US space military program. This involves the US government bringing former Nazi rocket scientists from Germany to the US after World War II under what was called Project Paperclip, 1,000 of them, including Wernher von Braun, who became the associate director of the US NASA program. At the US Army's Redstone Army Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, von Braun and his Nazi colleagues, former Nazi colleagues, maybe or maybe not, worked on producing a modified V2. The Nazis had the V1 for Vengeance 1 and then 2 rocket, which they call, this is the US replica of it or a version of it, the Redstone, after the Redstone Army Arsenal. It was the first US rocket capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. Meanwhile, former German Major General Walter Dornberger, who had been in charge of the entire Nazi rocket program as a consultant to the US Air Force, advisor to the Department of Defense, wrote a planning paper for his new employees and employers in 1947, advancing a scheme for hundreds of nuclear-armed satellites orbiting at different altitudes, each capable of re-entering the atmosphere on command from Earth to proceed to their targets. The Air Force began early work on Dornberger's scheme under the acronym NABS for Nuclear Armed Bombardment Satellites. A U.S. Space Command, a forerunner of this U.S. Space Force, was formed in 1982, and as it declared in that report that Dave just spoke about, Vision for 2020, which just happens to be this year, U.S. Space Command dominating the space dimension of military operations to, now this is cute, to protect U.S. interests and investment, integrating space forces into warfighting capabilities across the full spectrum of conflict. The U.S. Space Command was set up, says Vision for 2020, by the U.S. to help institutionalize the use of space, or as the motto of one of its units, which is now part of the Space Force, declares, to be master of space. It's politically sensitive, but it's going to happen, declared U.S. Space Commander-in-Chief Joseph Ashley in 1996. Some people don't want to hear this, and it sure isn't in vogue, but absolutely, we're going to fight in space. We're going to fight from space. We're going to fight into space. We will engage terrestrial targets someday, ships, airplanes, land targets from space. Or as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space, Keith Hall, said in 1997, with regard to space dominance, we have it, we like it, and we're going to keep it. And the US is now going back to this dark side today, and we must stop this. We must preserve and expand the grand vision, the great vision of the Outer Space Treaty, and keep space for peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karl. There's some questions coming in now. I think we'll take the questions at the end of when the panelists have spoken, but if any panelists would like to keep an eye on the questions, and if there's one you want to answer, then be ready to tackle that. You can see them on the Q&A list. And so please do enter some questions, comments as we go along. Thank you, Karl, for putting the case there about the militarization of space and the nuclearization of space too, which is extremely important. So now I think I'd like to go to Aruna Kammila. Are you there, Aruna? She may have disappeared for a moment. Okay, maybe could we go on to Tamara? Sorry, are you okay to carry on, Tamara?
Absolutely, no problem. Please go ahead, Aruna. You're no problem.
No, actually, I'm trying to share my slides. I'm sorry, Tamara, if you want to continue, yes, you may.
Aruna, I think with you being available now, I think that would be great for you to go. Please go ahead.
Okay, give me 1 minute. I'm just trying to share my video. Sorry, slides, PowerPoints. Yes, I got it. Yes. Yes, is my PPT visible? Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you. Carry on.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. Actually, I'm going to present a topic on militarization of space and India. So before I proceed any further, I just wanted to give a brief introduction about the Indian space activities. And even before that, I would like to say, as I always say, I once again reiterate at this August instance, explore but don't exploit. And this can be considered by any spacefaring nation. Of course, all the nations, all these spacefaring nations have almost surpassed the limits to even consider this phrase. And coming to the outset of today's discussion, that is militarization of space and India. And I'm going to explain about, give a brief description about this activities, space activities that India is actually carrying upon. I just wanted to introduce, before I proceed any further, before I discuss about the militarization of space by India. So India space programs, I would like to give like PSLV, Polar Satellite Launch Vehicles. One second, please. Yes, sir. And satellite programs like INSAT, satellite navigation programs, and extraterrestrial exploration like a Chandrayaan. It means literally that a travel to moon. Chandrayaan means in Indian language. Then Mars orbiter mission, which in short is called as MOM, and human spaceflight program, which is also called as Gagnon. And again, it means literally travel to sky. And it's also focusing on building up its own space station. So moving further, I would like to tell some more activities. And India is known as is known to be one of the largest satellite communication network user in the world. Most importantly, it uses the technology for telemedicine, which is one positive aspect, in fact. Wherein, because most of the, India is a developing nation, and many of the rural areas, they do not have efficient doctors or well-qualified doctors to treat the sick. So with the help of these satellites, what they're doing is they're trying to connect the doctors with the patients in the rural areas and the doctors in the urban areas, and that trying to provide them the medicine, and it's termed as telemedicine to the patients in rural areas. And also with various applications such as land management, all the ecosystem, and water resources management, natural disaster forecasting, radio networking, weather forecasting. Almost all the spacefaring nations might be involved in all these activities. And in the similar way, even India is involved in all these activities. And also it has launched the Cartosat series, and it has in fact launched 104 satellites, overtaking previous record of 37 satellites launched by Russia in 2014. In fact, it is generating revenue to the nation. So all these activities, most of the Indian nationals take a pride of. No doubt economy plays a vital role in survival and development of a nation. In course of this economic development, Indian space programs through ISRO, that is Indian Space Research Organization, reached heights in satellite production and launching capabilities. And many positive developments have taken place, which I just explained a while ago. I'm going to the next slide, okay. So the upcoming missions of Indian space activities are, it is planning for a radar imaging satellite, Chandrayaan-3, and which is expected to launch in early 2021 and launch the Indian human space flight program through its Gagnon mission. Then by Jan 2022, it wanted to launch the Aditya L1, Aditya means sun in Indian language, the first Indian solar coronagraph spacecraft mission to study the solar corona. And also this particular organization, ISRO, will be collaborating with NASA to launch NISAR, world's most expensive Earth imaging satellite, by September 2022, and also planning to launch its Venus mission in 2025. And France will be participating in it. And it's a joint venture by both the nations, and both the countries are also working on ISRO's human space mission of Gagnon project. And coming to the future plans, it has a future plans.
Kammila, we can't see the slides I think you're referring to. You may be
Oh,
sharing.
really? Oh, okay. Fine. I just, yes. Yeah,
There we go. Yeah, that's better.
yeah, yes. Yeah, is it visible now? Yes? Okay.
That's better. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. So it has many future plans as well, and along with these upcoming missions, which I just mentioned. So over the next 5 years, India is actually planning to reach a target of $50 billion, which means the Indian space sector would grow at an approximate rate of 48% CAGR. And the finance minister announced opening up the sector to private players in May. And this particular attitude of Indian government, I think it is actually following the footsteps of US, where they have already opened the space sector to the private parties, and none of the treaties, space treaties, outer space treaty, moon treaty, any of these treaties does not mention about these private parties' activities in space. And wherein already India has 300 private players in India's space tech segment, mostly working as suppliers to ISRO. And this particular commercial sector of ISRO, Antrix, has also been successful and generated more than $500 million in 2006 itself, over half of the operating cost of entire ISRO. And now coming to the defense activities, the most important part of today's discussion. So it has an integrated space cell under the Integrated Defense Staff of the Ministry of Defense, and this has been set up to utilize more effectively the country's space-based assets for military purposes and to look into threats to these assets. And then coming to the defense sector of Indian technology, it is managed by Defense Research and Development Organization, which is also called as DRDO, operates under the Indian Ministry of Defense. And India's missile technology, in fact, was developed by DRDO, establishing the cooperation between the two bodies, that is ISRO and the DRDO, though ISRO denies to this aspect. Two major military programs emerged out of India's current space capabilities. They are like a improvement of satellite reconnaissance capabilities and an integrated aerospace defense command, which were further prioritized after. In fact, this was prioritized only after China's ASAT test. However, both these pursuits, I think I need to move to the next slide. Yes. Please bear with me, I'm sorry. Oops. So these pursuits have been on the Indian agenda since late 1990s. And this is not a new concept to India as well. The primary motivations actually originated in 1999, the Kargil conflict with Pakistan, and this coupled with India's rising regional role. So the powerful impact of space assets on military power, particularly in the United States and China, and the ambitions of other nations in Asia also are noted by Indian defense officials. So China's advancing militarized use of space, Chinese space programs, both in military and dual use terms, actually this provoked India to venture into this defense activities, more into defense activities. So coming to the India's defense, the next one is India's budget on space activities, which I would like to mention a point upon. So in this, India's budget on space activities, the annual budget has crossed 10,000 crores, that is nearly $1.45 billion from 6,000 crore 5 years ago. And the budget allocation has increased to about 13,479 crores from about 12,473 crore. And ISRO has already requested an extra allocation of Indian rupees, that is 75 crore over and above the existing budget for India's next lunar mission. And the main reason for this particular aspect is not only just India, the other states, the most powerful nations, the other powerful spacefaring nations, they are actually increasing their annual budgets on these ventures, so on these activities. So India is actually following. Basically, I just want to say one more thing over here. Because of these powerful nations' activities, it is actually creating a kind of insecurity to the developing nations, which is actually provoking and leaving them with no other option than investing their funds on these acquisition of the ammunition, or even funding the militarization of activities, be it in space, on land, or navy, whatsoever it is. See, these nations are actually provoking the developing nations because they have this kind of insecurity in them. So US actually has spent about 13 times more than India in the space sector in 2018, that is nearly $19.5 billion. And China, which has become a key player in the field in the recent years, spent about 7 times more than Indian funding, that is $11 billion. And also Russia, it has spent $3.3 billion. So this way, India is actually following the footsteps of the powerful nations, and it is investing more on these activities. In fact, a developing nation like India cannot afford to fund on these activities. See, if it is for development, yes, it is sensible move, and it is for the greater good, yes, it is acceptable. But militarization space, for that particular activity, if India is funding, then I don't think it is a wise thing to do by a developing nation where it is lacking in many of its infrastructure, health, education, and many other aspects where it can fruitfully use these funds upon. Not only just India, even when it comes to US, I would like to say one thing over here. I think most of the US citizens, none of the US citizens for that matter, have free legal aid from the government. If I'm not wrong, many of the European nations are providing, including India. India is also providing free legal aid to its people. And when a developing nations can do that, I think US can also do if it can curtail some of its investments on these activities by provoking the other nations, pushing them into insecurity. So, and this race of arms, or beat arms, or even into spacefaring, is really so contagious, which started by following the footsteps of these powerful nations. And the day is not so far that even the non-governmental groups also might follow. And would any of these nations, any of these spacefaring nations, or any other nations would be able to control the catastrophe where all the nations are already struggling to eradicate the terrorism, especially when the private parties are involved in such ventures. In fact, we have started pushing this planet Earth to an unrevivable position with our greed and our power mongering, not sparing the heavens as well, without which the survival of the mankind will be at stake in the coming future. And I don't understand why these nations are, as Karl mentioned, we need to actually work on at the grassroots level. So there should be an awareness in the people that why is it really necessary, or what are the nations doing, and these powerful nations, in the guise of self-defense or even humanitarian interventions, how are they actually going against the UN Charter, though under Article 204 of UN Charter, all the members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So, but still, even after having this particular article in UN Charter, what is it that actually making these powerful nations attack other nations? It is under the guise of self-defense, under Article 51 of UN Charter, or even in the guise of humanitarian interventions. It is actually doing all these, taking up all these activities. So now the need of the hour is for us to have a new treaty. There is an immense necessity for us to have a new treaty which actually restricts all the nations from militarizing and weaponizing the space. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Aruna. That was really very interesting kind of view of what's happening in India. We don't always hear all of the details that that are coming from that country about the programs and so on. That's very useful. There is I think, a question for you to answer in the
Yes.
Q&A section. Maybe if you want
Yes.
to take that now, or do you want to wait?
I can take it in the end, not a problem.
Okay, fine.
Yes.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Tamara Lorincz from Canada. Tamara, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see my slides and hear me. I'm speaking to you today from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. I'm on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River. On Monday of this week in the United States, it was Indigenous Peoples Day. In Canada, we marked that day on June 21st. So I've been thinking about indigenous cosmological views. For the Indigenous people that are on the land that is now Canada, the heavens are and have always been important to their way of life. For the Anishinaabe people, there's a spiritual connection between the earth and the star world. In the stars, they see their ancestors, and when the stars are moving, they imagine their ancestors dancing. They have different names for the constellations, like the Big Dipper are the Fisher stars for the Indigenous people. So the Indigenous people, they have their own star stories. They have an oral tradition of telling and sharing stories about the heavens. Over the past 2 years, US and NATO have launched a dangerous new story of space as a contested, competitive domain of conflict. Last August, when President Trump launched the new military space command, he said space will be the next warfighting domain. NATO is perpetuating this dangerous, ominous narrative. In my remarks today, I will focus on NATO in space and informed by a Canadian perspective. And then I will close with discussing how vital it is that we resist the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. NATO is an aggressive nuclear-armed military alliance that is led by the United States and preserves Western dominance. It's comprised of 30 members, including Canada, which was one of the 12 founding members in 1949. Since its inception 71 years ago, NATO's allied commander has always been an American. The first, of course, was General Dwight Eisenhower. NATO should have been abolished and collapsed should have been abolished with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in 1992. Over the past 30 years, NATO has instead expanded. NATO has this so-called Partnership for Peace program to expand NATO beyond Europe, and it's trying to bring into its orbit countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and Colombia. Colombia is NATO's first Latin American partner. Let's think about Colombia for a moment. It's a US-backed narco state governed by a right-wing government of Ivan Duque that has connections to drug trafficking and is undermining the 2016 peace deal in the country. Colombia is one of the most violent countries in South America, a country where journalists are threatened and attacked, where human rights defenders are being killed in the hundreds. Last year, 300 human rights defenders and social movement leaders were killed, and so far 100 have been killed this year. Colombia is a close US ally and is causing tension and hostility with its neighbor, Venezuela. Colombia is a country that NATO is partnering with as the transatlantic alliance expands into Latin America. Just as it is nefarious that NATO has expanded to Latin America through Colombia, it is equally nefarious that NATO is expanding into space. At the 2018 NATO summit in Brussels, alliance leaders stated that that space is essential for their security, and they agreed to develop a new NATO space policy. Last summer, in June 2019, NATO defense ministers adopted a space policy. And until that point, NATO did not have a space mandate. 6 months later, at the Leader Summit in London, NATO members declared space a fifth operational domain alongside air, land, sea, and cyberspace. Yet the NATO space policy is not publicly available. I contacted NATO to ask for a copy of it, and they replied to me that it is classified. This lack of transparency about NATO space plans causes concern and distrust in the international community and undermines a fundamental principle of global governance. We can only speculate what NATO's plans are for space based on its aggressive operations on Earth and its destabilizing expansion into Eastern Europe and Latin America. Last year, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stated, "We have declared space an operational domain, recognizing its importance in keeping us safe and tackling security challenges while upholding international law." Upholding international law, NATO's post-Cold War record is riddled with repeated violations of international law. The 78-day illegal bombing of Serbia in 1999, the bombing and illegal regime change operation in Libya in 2011, war crimes committed in Afghanistan, and aiding the ongoing illegal US occupation of Iraq. Secretary General Stoltenberg also said that NATO has no intention to put weapons in space, but NATO is putting weapons everywhere on Earth. NATO is leading Canada right now is leading a NATO battle group with tanks in Latvia. Canada has fighter jets in Romania right now, right on Russia's border. Canada also has its warships in the Mediterranean for NATO. NATO in space risks the increased militarization of space and the weaponization of space. Of the 2,000 satellites currently orbiting Earth, roughly half are owned by NATO countries. The US dominates, of course, with 800 satellites. NATO primarily relies on the space capabilities of the US and the United Kingdom to provide data and information services such as imagery, navigation, situational awareness, weather monitoring, and early warning. NATO operates its own satellite communications program, SATCOM, but some of those satellites are defunct, but they're still orbiting Earth and they're flying the NATO logo. Last year, NATO authorized a $1 billion euro for new SATCOM services for the next 15 years. These space capabilities facilitate NATO's war making and wars. Just as war on Earth is good for business for the weapons manufacturers, so will conflict and war in space be. 2 years ago, it was reported that Pentagon brass were not keen on a new US Space Force because many military officials thought it would be redundant and too costly. Yet congressmen, backed by defense contractors, pushed for a new separate space command in the National Defense Authorization Act in 2018. And then in 2019, Mark Esper, the US Secretary of Defense, pushed hard for a US Space Force. Esper, of course, was the top lobbyist for Raytheon, and Raytheon manufactures space and airborne sensor systems that are used by the US military. Lockheed Martin, the largest manufacturer of technologies of violence, and it is also a speaker in this conference, is one of the companies to benefit the most from US Space Force. And just as Lockheed Martin has profited from the US wars on the planet, China and Russia are the only peer competitors to NATO in space. We know NATO is dangerously provoking Russia and China on Earth. War in space against Russia and China, which are nuclear powers, would be disastrous and risk an all-out nuclear war. Russia and China don't want space to be used as a domain of war. At the United Nations Conference on Disarmament, Russia and China have repeatedly put forward their draft treaty on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. They've done so in 2008, in 2014, and in 2018. However, because of Western countries' reluctance, and particularly opposition by the United States, this draft treaty to prevent war in space has not moved forward. Moreover, NATO and the United States undermine the United Nations, and they undercut international collaboration at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. This is why groups around the world are resisting NATO. This is why we're worried about NATO in space and why we want NATO abolished. Last year, the organization that I'm with, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, launched a campaign, Feminists Against Militarism, Women Say No to NATO. For NATO's 70th anniversary, we organized monthly demonstrations outside the NATO Association of Canada office in downtown Toronto. In Canada, we're very opposed to NATO's 2% target. At the Wales Summit in 2014, NATO members pledged to increase their military budgets to 2% of GDP by 2024. This is so that the alliance members are forced to buy new weapon systems and stay interoperable with the United States. NATO wastes $1 trillion on soldiers and weapons every year. And at this time when funding is desperately needed for the global healthcare crisis and the climate emergency, and to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, NATO countries are irresponsibly increasing their military budgets. And in fact, it's NATO that has made us unprepared for the pandemic and unprepared for climate-induced forest fires, floods, and hurricanes. Last year, I wrote an article, NATO is a threat to the climate. I would be happy to share this article with you. NATO is also a threat to space. I hope that you will join us to call for the abolition of NATO. This is us at the Global Network with our banner, No to NATO, Keep Space for Peace. And I want to end by thinking about peaceful alternatives to NATO, international and regional bodies like the United Nations and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, international law, make the alliance totally unnecessary. We have to push for global cooperation and peace in space. This is possible, especially with the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, which welcomes all countries, as opposed to NATO, which is an exclusive military alliance. And finally, I think about the International Space Station, the research laboratory that orbits the Earth. The United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, and Russia work together on the ISS. Astronauts from South Africa, Brazil, Netherlands, and Malaysia have also been welcomed to the International Space Station. But the country that has not been welcomed is China. China has been barred since 2011. And that's when Congress, under the Obama administration, passed a law prohibiting official American contact with the Chinese space program due to a national security. But for peace in space, this must change. We need to build international resistance to NATO. We need to stop this dangerous American and NATO narrative of space as a domain for war. We need to co-create a story, a star story of space, a fragile global commons as a domain for peace and international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara, from your NATO and from Canada. We're getting a bit short of time, so I'm going to go straight on to Bruce now. Bruce Gagnon.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for listening in. In 1989, I organized a protest at the Kennedy Space Center opposing the weaponization and nuclearization of space. And our speaker on that occasion was an Apollo astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, one of the early moonwalkers. And in his speech, he said that if we have one war in space, it will be the one and only. And the reason will be because so much debris or junk, space junk will be created that life on Earth will literally shut down. Because of the cascading effect of all the space debris that would be created by a war in space, satellites would be smashing into each other, the International Space Station would be destroyed, etc. And then back here on Earth, cell phones, television, banking, traffic lights, monitoring for weather, everything would close down because we would no longer have access to space. And Mitchell concluded by saying that we would be entombed to the planet Earth forever, that it would be like a piranha-laced river orbiting the planet, and we wouldn't be able to get a rocket off it again. Clearly, the United States military and NATO and other countries around the world, they're aware of this problem, but still they move on. It's almost like they're blinded by a sickness of greed and power and money. This is what's driving this whole plan to move war into the heavens, to be the dominant power in space. And this sickness must end. And this is the reason why we created the Global Network in 1992, to talk to the people of the world saying, is this what you want? Is this the kind of future you want? Well, surely it can't be. Some years ago, in one of the industry publications called Space News, they ran an editorial saying that they had to be responsible corporate citizens and come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for everything space. And they said, we have. And they called it the entitlement programs in the United States, which officially are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the social safety net that is in tatters today. And in that editorial, Space News said they are now, the aerospace industry is now sending their lobbyists to Washington to secure that dedicated funding source, the entitlement programs. And so clearly, it's like two trains heading for a collision. The idea of social justice, social development, and also dealing with our real problem today that we have on this planet, climate crisis. The only way out for us is to stop this wasteful madness of trying to move the arms race into space and invest that money in dealing with climate crisis here while we still can. And time is running out very quickly. I want to just talk about one aspect of the US space domination program, which is missile defense. It's really misnamed. It should be called missile offense because it's part of US first strike attack planning. It's the shield to be used after a US first strike attack on Russia and China. We know this because for years, it's been reported in Aviation Week and Space Technology and other industry publications that the US Space Command has been annually wargaming a computer war game against Russia and China, where the US launches a first strike attack, tries to take out all of their nuclear capability, land, sea, and air-based nuclear forces. But they don't get all of it. And so then Russia and China would fire a retaliatory strike. It is then that these so-called missile defense systems, or SHIELD, would be used to pick off any remaining retaliatory strike, giving the US a quote-unquote successful first strike attack. The idea that the United States still believes that first strike is possible and today refuses to rule it out, while Russia and China for years have ruled out a first strike attack. They say they would only fire in retaliation after they were hit in such a first strike. Today, the United States has built missile defense ground-based launch facilities in Poland and Romania, right on the Russian border. They call it Aegis Ashore, where they have Standard Missile 3 interceptor missiles that are also deployed on US Navy Aegis destroyers, but now they've put them on land. And in addition, these same launch platforms in Romania and Poland can also fire with just a slight change in the launch tubes. They can fire Tomahawk cruise missiles, nuclear capable first strike attack weapons that could, from Romania and Poland, could reach Moscow in 10 minutes time. Now imagine how Russia feels about having these launch platforms in Romania and Poland right along their borders. And at the same time, having US Navy Aegis destroyers with these same capabilities coming into the Barents Sea, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, bumping up as close as possible to the Russian borders. At the same time, the US is doing the same thing in the Asia Pacific, encircling China with these same missile defense technologies, putting them in Guam, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and on these same Aegis destroyer warships. All of this is provocative and dangerous, but the United States continues on because it believes it is an exceptional nation and has the right to dominate not only the earth on behalf of corporate interests, but also space as well. I just want to say that there's a second mission for the Space Force that we rarely talk about. Besides controlling space on behalf of corporate interests, in spite of using it as a military attack mechanism to control the planet Earth, Space Force would have a second job, which is to control the pathway on and off the planet Earth. The Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Treaty said that no country can claim ownership of any of the planetary bodies. No country, no individual, no corporation. But during the Obama administration, Barack Obama signed a law giving the United States the right to allow corporations to claim ownership of the planetary bodies for mining the sky, for precious minerals and resources. And so this is the new gold rush. This is the new recreating the global war system that came out of the early 14th, 15th, 16th century, when European powers were fighting over control of the world with their various navies so that they could control markets and resources and people around the world. We're now poised to see the same thing move off into the heavens. Well, we can't allow this. We can't afford this. And we're not going to live very long if we allow this to happen. I urge people to check out our website, the Global Network website, spaceforpeace.org. I put the link in the chat box, and we invite you to join the Global Network and help us keep space for peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. There are some questions. We have some time left to tackle some of these questions at least. One is addressed to Karl and one is addressed to Aruna. So you have those ones sorted out. I wondered if the other panelists might look at the other questions, mostly from Mark Peters and other one from Kevin Fries in the chat box. If you could decide if you want to tackle any of those questions. But let's first of all go to perhaps Karl. Would you like to tackle the question from Jay Lee? Can you see it on your?
Yeah, I think with Jay Lee and with Mark Peters, we have an extension of the propaganda that the U.S. is espousing, that we have to do this. We have to have a space. We have to achieve what the orange-haired president calls the high ground of space. And in the military terminology, that means you're at the high ground, you can dominate because of this threat from China and from Russia. And despite what those people asking questions claim about China and Russia and ground-based orbital destructions, and it's just the propaganda. It's just creating a boogeyman to justify this leadership by the United States, working very hard to turn space into a war zone. Now, this is not saying that Russia and China are not going to get involved in the militarization and ultimately perhaps the weaponization of space if the U.S. continues to do what it's doing. They're not going to sit back. They're not going to allow the United States, one country, to dominate space. But as to China and Russia now, look, again, I've been to these countries. I've spoken to Russian and Chinese diplomats. It's not, but it will if the U.S. continues to do what it's doing.
Okay, thank you, Karl. Aruna, would you like to address the question?
Yes, I would like to. So first of all, I would like to address the India-Chinese relation. In China being the neighbor state, it always, just not only now, but from even from ages, we have differences. India has differences with China, and especially from 2014, there are the relationships have strained a lot, and near the Ladakh, Nathula, Sikkim, India. Many battles have happened, and even of late, very recently also, they fought with each other. Both the Indian armies and the Chinese armies, they fought with each other. Even in very recently in June 2020 as well. So China was always. It is a known fact that India and Pakistan, they never had good relation with each other. So whenever China supports Pakistan, India feels very insecure. And not only that, even when it comes to US also, only after Barack Obama's administration, they have started accommodating more Indian policies, and they had better relationships. And before that, they were actually in support of Pakistan. So all these political relations, they are not constant. They change according to their requirements, their necessities, their own benefits. So you never know when what will happen, and who's going to support whom. So I think this explains about that question, which I think I did try to explain this.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else like to tackle any of the other questions?
Yeah, one thing we've not discussed, which we should, it was mentioned by Bruce, but it's very important, this whole notion of mining the sky, that there are riches out there on asteroids and on the moon and so forth. In fact, in my book, which is entitled The Wrong Stuff, I quote a Air Force, high Air Force officer speaking at a space conference in Washington, D.C., saying that we're not going to be able to further U.S. space activity on the basis of scientific exploration. We got to insert greed into the equation, is what this guy said. And now we have greed, that there's all kind of riches out there that we have to mine. Moreover, more so than ever before, U.S. corporations are deeply involved in space militarization, space weaponization. SpaceX, a big player, and these corporations are there to make money, guys. And so when you have money-making, gigantic U.S. corporations, among them, incidentally, Lockheed Martin, the biggest weapons manufacturer in the world, deeply involved in the U.S. program, and SpaceX and these other new, now that kind of NASA has pulled back with a lot of its activities, privatized them. Greed is very much part of the equation today.
Thank you.
I'd like to say something.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Aruna, could you mute, please? Good, thank you. Well, you know, I've been hearing this Russia, you know, and China, we've got to stop them. They really are the aggressive ones. The United States is only reacting to them. I've been hearing that for the last 30 years, but all during the Bill Clinton years as president, the George W. Bush years as president, the Obama years as president, and now the Trump years as president, the United States, as Tamara said earlier, has been blocking the development of a treaty at the United Nations to ban weapons in space that China and China and Russia have been bringing to the UN General Conference on Disarmament. So if they were so eager to you know, dominate space themselves, why would they be regularly and aggressively trying to get a treaty banned? And why would the United States, if it was so well intentioned, why wouldn't it want to have a treaty? The fact is the weapons corporations in America are the ones that run the show, virtually run our government. And it's quite clear that they recognize that they'll make massive profit from a new arms race in space. They're again blinded by that greed and that sense of power. all you have to do is look at the numbers. If you don't trust anything that we've said, just look at the numbers. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute every year does a report on global military spending. And in the year 2018, the United States spent 34% of the world total. And when you add the various NATO countries, their spending to the US total, it comes to about 60% of the world total. Well, how about Russia and China? Those two very aggressive countries, right? Well, in 2018, Russia spent 3.4%, 3.4% of the world total, and China was 14. So clearly, they are way behind in terms of spending, and likely, I believe, they're way behind in capability. So they're not driving this arms race in space. It's the United States, without a doubt.
Thank you. I think somebody did comment, David Engelman commented that we didn't speak about Russia and China's development of various anti-satellite programs as previously discussed during other panels today. Well, I think that maybe that's why, because that's already been discussed. And I think our panel was really more about what's driving all of these weaponization and militarization of space. And I think, as you've probably got the message by now, we believe it's the United States which is driving this. And they're the ones that need really to be tackled on this issue. And we need to ask them questions about why they're behaving in this particular way. I think the answer's already been said. It's in the pursuit of resources, space resources, and capital by the big corporations. I think we're kind of more or less out of time, but we're still here. So if anybody wants to add anything, if there are any more questions that people want to put, please do. But in the meantime, I'll just say that this has been, I think, a very useful session, certainly for me. I hope you found it useful too. I think the rest of the conference has been probably slightly different to this, but that's fine. It's great that the conference organizers gave us the opportunity to speak. Also, I wanted to emphasize this website, www.spaceforpeace.org, is the Global Network website. If you want to know more information about the Global Network and our activities, you can find it there. Also, I think we are on Facebook, and I think some people anyway tweet quite a lot. I don't tweet very much, but others do. So you can catch up with what we're doing from the website, from Facebook, and so on. Anybody want to add anything else quickly before we finish? I think Gabriella is entering the...
Thank you guys for participating today. I think the call is going to close in a couple seconds. We have more sessions for the rest of the day for anybody interested. And we have more panels and sessions tomorrow as well. So thank you guys for joining and participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
job, Dave. Good job. Very good job, Dave.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.